Evan Osnos writes for The New Yorker, as you know, and he's an expert on political power, on social power, and financial power. His book on Joe Biden, which came out as Biden captured the presidency during COVID, captures the essence of political ambition and the final capture of the office which he sought for so long. I love that book. I also love his columns in The New Yorker, which brings us to tonight. His new book, The Haves and Have-Yachts, puts a bunch of ultra-rich individuals onto microscope slides, and it's so fun. He turns the magnification knob to max. We all have heard about the multi-million-dollar birthday parties with rock superstars providing the entertainment. Sure, that's a perk of being ultra-rich. Their social and financial excesses are often really wildly funny, always outlandish, and often completely and utterly obscene. Their sense of entitlement as well, as in Jeff Bezos suggesting that the Dutch government ought to dismantle a bridge because his new super toy wouldn't fit under the bridge, is one example of many. But as Evan does what he does best, he slips in the facts that we peasants need to know about the chasm between rich and poor, about the impact of inequality, and about the massive political influence that these ultra-rich people wield. I want to just interject one thing that I forgot to say. I really appreciate all of you being here tonight in light of what's going on in Los Angeles and, you know, braving the Navy and the Army and the whatever else is necessary to, you know, to handle LA. Okay. Ben Rhodes knows his way around political influence and power imbalance. He served in the Obama White House as a deputy national security advisor and was a speechwriter for Obama. You've seen him all over NBC and MSNBC, as well as on Crooked Media's Pod Save the World. In his spare time, he writes best-selling books, including After the Fall, The Rise of Authoritarianism in the World We've Made. So here's what's going to happen tonight. Evan and Ben will chat, and when they're through, you can ask questions, and I will pass a mic around so that you can ask your questions into the mic. Please, no speeches, just questions that end with a question mark. Evan's new book, The Haves and Have-Yachts, is the perfect gift for Father's Day and perfect for right now in this moment in time. He will sign the book afterwards in the lobby, and I urge you to get them. Get plural books. Anyway, thanks a million, Evan Osnos and Ben Rhodes.
All right, well, thank you all for being here in these interesting times in our city. Thank you for being here, Evan.
My pleasure. Thank you, Ben.
I just want to start by saying I really love this book. I love these pieces. We read many of them when they came out. I'm a huge...
You are my target demographic, let's be
honest. You know, as our entire...
Yeah, for this symposium on adventure in men's fashion, I want to thank you all for coming.
I had to say, though, I sent you a note when I saw this was coming out, like, I'm a huge fan of these kinds of compilations that kind of curate like around a topic that's both a topic that you have plumbed the depths of, but also a topic that is absolutely fundamental to understanding and unpacking where we are and how we got here. But before we work our way into those big questions, I thought we'd start with like the fun of this book, because it is great fun. And I don't usually do this, but you've raised this. Like, I think reading like a paragraph, let's face it, about the yachts, we all know about the yachts, is a good way for us to start a discussion. So why don't you
I just gotta
find that. Yeah, I'll just filibuster while you're doing that.
Find that key moment. I think I can probably find my way to it.
It is, I'll just say, I had not seen these yachts myself until I was in France a couple years ago, and I passed through, I don't know, one of these towns that was known for this.
Yeah.
And I went on a run, and I went out, and my idea of a yacht is like, you know, I don't know, a boat that's about as big as like the seats, you know?
Something you can dock in New
This
Hampshire.
is like the Titanic, you know?
Yeah.
But anyway, take it away, Evan.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. I think, and I will say, we'll talk a little bit about this idea of these collections around an idea, but that was exactly the animating impulse here, was to try to capture a moment in as specific and granular terms as possible, because it's actually temporary, it's vanishing, and these moments go away, and I kind of feel like I wanted to capture what it felt like, what the experience was on the inside of a subculture. And for that, I did heroic duty and went to the Yacht Club of Monaco, for which I have yet to receive hazard pay, I will point out. So in the course of this piece, I found myself at this yacht club in Monaco, and I'll just read a couple of sentences about that. Hold on, let me just get to the right. Okay. Inside my cabin, I quickly came to understand that I would never be fully satisfied anywhere else again. I just want to give you actually the detail that here we are. The next morning, I was on my terrace enjoying the latest delivery by the service members, an airy French omelet and a glass of preternaturally fresh orange juice. I thought guiltily of my wife at home with our kids, who had sent a text overnight alerting me to a maintenance issue that she described as a toilet debacle. But then I was distracted by the sight of a man on a yacht in the marina below. He was staring up at me. I went back to my brunch, but when I looked again, there he was, a middle-aged man on a mid-tier yacht, juiceless on a grayish banquette, staring up at my perfect terrace. A surprising sensation started in my chest and moved outward like a warm glow, the unmistakable pang of superiority.
So let's start with a couple of these subcultures. Let's start with the yachts. And one question I have is, having spent some time looking into this, you answer this in the piece, but describe to us, Jeff Bezos is like the far end of this, right? He's got this remarkable yacht, but what is the animating compulsion for these ever larger vessels that these guys are acquiring?
So I think it's useful to describe what we're talking about in specific terms. The super yacht, actually the giga yacht, which is the largest form of these things, is the most expensive object that humans have ever figured out how to own. A giga yacht is a pleasure vessel that is the length of a football field, the length of a city block. They cost upwards of $500 million. And in the case of Jeff Bezos, as you mentioned, he has his main yacht, and then he has like an auxiliary yacht that follows, sort of shuffles along behind the main yacht and carries all of the things like the helicopter and stuff like that. And we've never had anything like this until very recently in our history. In 1990, there were about 10 of these giant yachts. Today, there are more than 170. There are also about 5,000 regular super yachts, a term that I never thought I would be uttering in my life. And by the way, the regular super yachts, this I didn't put into the book, but happens to be one of my favorite facts. The regular super yachts have been dwarfed by these newer big ones to such an extent that the regular ones are now called pocket yachts. And yeah, I think imagine a man spends, and they are men, who spends $100 million on a yacht, and somebody comes up to him and says, that's a nice little pocket yacht. But honestly, I had this moment when I realized that this needed to be written about at some ludicrous length, which was that I was standing at the launch of this, at one of these yachts, and it's up on these slings, and it's about to be lowered into the water. And I was watching it, and I was thinking to myself, this is like an artifact, an archaeological artifact in the making, in the sense that in some future moment, there's going to be an archaeologist who is going to be sifting through the sands, and they're going to come upon the outlines of this giant ark, this sumptuous machine. And they're going to try to figure out, well, what civilization created these objects of steel and suede? And clearly it was some sort of object of worship or ritual. If not that, then maybe it tells us something meaningful about that society and what they valued and what they cared about and who had power and who did not. I said that's the makings of something I think worth writing about.
Yeah, I mean, we're going to get into our country, which is at the vanguard of this trend. But one thing about the yachts, and it applies to some of the other subcultures you write about, is what are these people have more in common with each other than they have with most of the people in the countries where they live, right? And actually, one of the reasons that they're not people with pitchforks coming for them is that most people, the vast majority of the world's people, and this is why books like yours are important, and why reportage is important. Most people never see this. They're kind of tucked away, right? Like they gather in these pockets of places in the water or in Monaco or wherever. What is your sense of the creation of a kind of super class of globalized yacht owners? Is that a new phenomenon where the super rich from anywhere on earth, whether a Russian oligarch has more in common with an American oligarch than they have with their own country people?
There is a specific cohort. You've hit on something important, which is the community that these things serve and that they represent, in effect. And it's worth just reminding ourselves that, as I said, there didn't used to be very many of these, and they are, in their way, they are symbols of a kind of borderless period of capital. I had this fascinating conversation with a guy who has been in the yachting world for a long time. He's been standing out in the sun so long. He's kind of the color of a catcher's mitt by now, and he has wearing a great blazer and so on. And he said, I've watched the generations come and go in the yacht world. He started off, he said it was the shipping fortunes. It was like Aristotle Onassis and the Niarchoses, people like that. And they would compete. They would build slightly larger yachts than their rivals would have every few years. But the saying at the time, the old-fashioned saying was, this is to convey that you didn't really want your yacht to be seen. You didn't really want to be visible in the world. The word in the private wealth management world was, the whale that never surfaces doesn't get harpooned.
There you go.
Yeah. And actually, this came into sort of vivid focus for me because Aristotle Onassis' yacht, in addition to having a Matisse in the master bedroom, also had bar stools that were upholstered with the foreskins of whales. Yeah. Imagine how whales feel about that fact, by the way.
Wait, you guys don't have that? Or,
yeah, I'm sorry. It's an option. You just have to scroll down.
But,
But the thing that I kept thinking was, so after the shipping fortunes, then you began to have the oil era yachts. And so you had the Saudis and Adnan Khashoggi, remember the arms dealer, had a famous yacht, which he lost in a criminal proceeding and then was acquired by a young real estate developer named Donald Trump, who rechristened it the Trump Princess. But Trump hated yachts. He said, I don't want to be on the water, I hate it. And he said, but I like to be seen on it. And then it got claimed during one of his bankruptcies, and off we go. And then after that, there was another generation, which was the internet era tycoon. And they bought yachts, and they kind of made them all the color of like Sonoma, sort of very pale and kind of no pigment in the yachts. And now it's the crypto generation, and they're buying yachts. And they are, to your point, they are, by nature of how they made their money and how they choose to spend it, they're not particularly rooted in one political society or another. They regard themselves with some active hostility to the constraints, the kind of surly bonds of the law and the politics of the United States. That's sort of part of the point. And I think, in a way, these machines are the expression of the possibility of escaping those powers. And there's just a delicious little irony at the last bit of this rather unintended monologue on the topic. But recently, because of the war in Ukraine, there was an effort, as you guys will remember, there was an effort to seize some yachts. And that worked, actually. The United States and allies, Italy, Spain, and so on, they seized a bunch of yachts. And in other cases, there were also yachts that had been commissioned and couldn't be taken by their owners because that person had been sanctioned, or because of European law made it no longer possible to deliver it. And so as a result, some people in Silicon Valley have been picking up these Russian oligarch yachts for a song. Mark Zuckerberg, for instance, recently took possession of one that was commissioned by a Russian oligarch, and for $500 million, and it was considered a great bargain in the industry. And I sort of let that irony speak for itself, but we're at a point now where that has become the signifier. I had a CEO in Silicon Valley say to me, he said, he owns a yacht. He said, well, a yacht in the end is the best way to absorb excess capital, which I thought is a sentence that should be written on stone and buried along with the yacht for the archaeologists to find someday.
We're going to get to Mark Zuckerberg as we enter into American politics, but before, I want to do one more subculture. I grew up in New York, went to a lot of bar mitzvahs. And I remember in the hierarchy of bar mitzvahs, there was a restaurant called Mickey Mantle's.
Yeah.
It was owned by Mickey Mantle.
Yeah.
And the coolest bar mitzvah you could have is rent out the party room at Mickey Mantle's, and oh, sorry. And then when I was in the White House, I'm not betraying any classified information here because this is all openly available information.
Search WikiLeaks for bar mitzvah and see if it's in
but
there. We'll find out.
It's extending beyond bar mitzvahs to weddings and other things. I started to notice that, if you ever wondered whatever happened to Lionel Richie, he would play at any, oligarch or dictator's, whatever ceremony. And then actually this became a thing when Gaddafi fell, because Saif al-Gaddafi, Gaddafi's fabulously corrupt son, had Beyonce, I think, and some other people perform at parties of his. You have an amazing story in this book about this industry of bringing performers for lavish fees to these parties. Some of whom, we all know, Drake and, Lionel Richie. And then I have to admit, I learned about Florida.
Florida. Yeah.
See, I'm just, who is the most delightful character because
you're an intellectual.
But
I get it.
Florida is delightfully and blissfully perplexed by the fact that he is performing at bar mitzvahs and weddings and stuff or whatever. What do you, when you explore this subculture of these kind of celebrity performers, because these people would only also play 2 or 3 songs, right? Why do people want to pay millions of dollars to have Florida or whoever play 2 or 3 songs? Is it because their kids or they actually appreciate the music? Is it more the status, like Florida is a pocket yacht and Beyonce's a giga yacht?
Right.
I mean, what is the motivating factor for this ever competitive subculture?
Kind of an arms race of bar mitzvah entertainment.
Yeah.
I think this is another one of these things that really didn't exist in particularly large numbers. It had always been around. You can go back and you can find Louis Armstrong playing a party, 1 million years ago. But until relatively recently, if you were a banker or a successful entrepreneur, you would spend your fortune on getting front row seats at an arena show, or maybe you get a skybox or something like that. I talked to a lot of artists, a lot of musicians in the course of reporting this essay about kind of what does the private gig market, what does it tell us about the artists? What does it tell us about the clients, and what does it tell us about the cultural economy in this country? I wanted to understand. It tells us something. And early on, a drummer who I talked to who does a lot of these gigs, private events. He said, well, look, the reality was until recently, nobody could afford to have the Foo Fighters in their backyard on a Thursday. And now you can. And as a result, there's been this expectation. And this is the key point, is that at a certain point, it became kind of the table stakes, that if you're in a certain slender stratum of American life, then your kids have gone to these events. And so then it becomes, the pressure is on. Are you going to be able to get Lionel Richie or J-Lo or somebody else? And it turns out, I mean, this is, like the yachts, this is a world that is really not that excited when the New Yorker magazine calls up and says, I want to talk to you about this, about the finances of this business. You get a lot of lawyers calling back, actually. And because a lot of these things are governed by NDAs and on both sides. So eventually, so I was calling a million artists trying to get somebody to kind of really let me hang out. And eventually, somebody said, I was having lunch with a guy and he said, you know, I think Flo Rida would let you hang. And I was like, okay, so I got in touch with Flo Rida's people, and I was like, is he doing any private gigs? They're like, yeah, he's doing a lot of private gigs. I said, and they're like, well, yeah, if you can get yourself to Chicago, like on next Thursday, you can embed for a bar mitzvah. And I was like, I think I can die happy. That may be the greatest line I've ever heard in journalism. And then I faced a really serious issue, which is, what do I wear? And I realized, I was like, I think the only plausible kind of scenario is that I should just dress like an agent. Yeah. So I dressed like what I thought an agent would look like. And I kind of, you know, everything except carrying a clipboard. I just tried to look as officious as I could. And then I talked to there was nothing undercover about it. I just didn't want to freak out the kids. But so I was talking to the parents who had hired Flo Rida for, you know, $250,000 to entertain their 13-year-olds. And the dad, at one point said, you know, he's talking to me about it. He's like, oh, this man, what a hit. This has been such a success. And he says, by the way, I work in finance, so I don't put my name in there because I don't want to end up on page 6. And there's this whole way in which it was this really specific thing. And this gets to both your first question and to this question, which is he was broadcasting to his cohort, his friends who were there attending, like the other grown-ups. He wanted them to see that he had spent $250,000 on the bar mitzvah entertainment. But God forbid that the outside world see it. And that's true of the yachts too. They exist in this conditional state of visibility in which they're intended to be unmistakable signifiers of status for the small people who can read those signs and imperceptible to everybody else in society. And there was a moment of like some years ago that actually really drove this home when a big technologist, a guy who's a very famous figure, had a new yacht that was coming online. Not to go back to yachts, but it is kind of the flywheel of this whole phenomenon. And when the boat was launched, he put signal flags, naval signal flags, that looked, if you were walking by and you didn't know what you were looking at, you thought, oh, that's kind of a festive decoration on that beautiful boat. But if you could read the naval signal flags, it said, I'm paraphrasing, but it said something like, you are looking at the greatest ostentatious thing you've ever seen. And they're playing, so there's a self-awareness of a curious kind. Yeah. And I had another guy say to me at one point, well, actually, perhaps a more eloquent description would be what a yacht owner said to one of his guests, who then told me about it. He said, the owner said, you know, you and I both have a driver. We both have a chef. We both fly private. He said, so really the only way that I can indicate to the world that I am in a different effing category than you is the boat. This is to a guest.
Yeah. All right, so we're going to start to work our way into politics here.
Was it something I said?
No. It was just, there's this voice in my head hearing you talk that is just saying, how did we get here? But I'm going to work our way into this through Silicon Valley.
Yeah.
And let's take Mark Zuckerberg, right?
Yeah.
I find Mark Zuckerberg...
Where should we take him? Oh, I'm sorry, I misunderstood.
Here's how I want to take this. I always, when Mark Zuckerberg kind of came on the radar, and then when I first kind of encountered Mark Zuckerberg, it was like the early Obama years, right? And there were kind of two Mark Zuckerbergs.
Yeah.
There was the Mark Zuckerberg who wanted to be the biggest, richest, megalomaniacal tech bro out there. And he wanted to win and make as much money and be as big as possible. But there was this Mark Zuckerberg who felt some, and I don't think it was virtuous, but some need to at least try to project that what he was doing was to the society's benefit. We're connecting everybody. We're democratizing information and building relationships, and he was always kind of trying to balance these two personas, right? And that persisted, even through the 2016 election when they were a little sheepish about the fact that they'd basically been the key tool that allowed Trump to win the first election, and even after January 6th, when they took down Trump's account. Fast forward to the inauguration, and this is why the book is so timely, when you have Zuckerberg, Bezos, Sundar, Tim Cook, all these guys on the dais. To me, that was a signal that one side of their personalities had won. That essentially we don't even have to pretend anymore. And actually, Mark Zuckerberg looked quite liberated, going on like Joe Rogan and being like, "I've actually never liked any of this stuff," and that's not a direct quote for any lawyers that may be watching, but essentially that was the gist of what he's saying. I mean, how can we trace the kind of degradation of our society through the kind of apotheosis of this particular kind of tech mindset where you don't even have to pretend that there's any societal good in this anymore. It's just about who's winning.
I think you've identified an important moment, which was that there was this decision about how shall we be in society as these new giants. I mean, there was, the great motto on the cover of the Whole Earth catalog, which was a kind of predecessor to the internet, was "We are as gods, and we should learn to," I'm going to butcher the rest of it, but we should learn to be good at it. And that ethos is very much in the mind of what animates you when you run an organization of the scale and of the influence of something that Mark Zuckerberg made. It's worth reminding ourselves, a dozen years, 14 years after he started this thing in his dorm room, it had more adherents than Christianity. And all of a sudden, he is called upon to try to make decisions about things like the nature of truth, the nature of hate, the origins of violence, the connection between ideas and action.
And this is a guy who literally started this tool to rate the looks of girls in his dorm.
Yeah, and then dropped out of college and then stayed in an organization of his own making and his own. So then he furnished the world around him with people that he trusted and that would ultimately support him in his process. And this is kind of a lesson beyond just one company or one person, that this is what happens when you get surrounded by, and ultimately you get rid of people who are making your life less smooth. And as a result, you can suffer what becomes known as authoritarian backlash. That's what scholars call it. That is, frankly, what happened to Vladimir Putin when you get surrounded by people who tell you, well, sure, I think you'll be in Kyiv in 48 hours. I don't see how the Ukrainians could possibly resist you. But to go back to this important point, because you're absolutely right, there was a time when Mark Zuckerberg was, in many ways, patterning himself after a generation that consisted of people like Bill Gates and Warren Buffett, but even before that, he was kind of borrowing, he was kind of humming a few bars from the age of John D. Rockefeller.
And Carnegie,
and Carnegie.
Schools. And,
Exactly. Because after all, they had represented this sort of apex of American wealth. Carnegie had said, I realize if I don't give something back, it was partly for religious reasons, but it was also partly for a sense of his place in society. And he created 3,000 libraries, which we still use today. And it was designed to try to combat illiteracy. Rockefeller founded the University of Chicago, gave away half of his wealth before the end of his life, and then his son gave away 90% of what was left. And then you get to this other generation, Bill Gates and Warren Buffett. And I'll just stipulate, look, nobody is perfect or completely imperfect, but I'm just trying to describe people as reference points on how we got here. And Zuckerberg was very clearly patterning himself after Gates. You know, he and his wife started a foundation dedicated to public health and education and on and on and on. He was kind of associating with liberal politics. And at a certain point, I think he got scorched by the realization that he wasn't prepared, frankly, to handle those kinds of questions that I was just talking about. I mean, he could code in the middle of the night and he could run a company. But these are very subtle elements of human affairs. I remember one very telling detail I spent a long time building a profile of him, talking to a lot of people about him. And there was one little moment that really stayed with me, which was once he's really into board games, and once he was playing Scrabble on a plane with the daughter of a friend, and she beat him in the first game. And so he wrote a little program, quickly wrote a computer program that would allow him to look up all the tiles that he had in the dictionary and give him all the possible words that he could use, and then they played another...
To beat this kid?
To beat the child, yeah. But no, my point, though, was... And it was part of, she was aware of it, but the whole idea was... And everybody on the plane started to crowd around. It was a private plane. Everybody starts crowding around, and they started rooting for either Team Human or Team Machine. And in a way, I think that Zuckerberg decided that he may not actually be all that at home on Team Human in the conditions that society expected of him. And this is what's kind of lurking slightly over the horizon, is that a lot of the folks who we're talking about here are playing with the boundary of the power of the human and the power of the machine. And in all obvious ways, we're right here at the advent of like a new era of power in the machines with artificial intelligence.
Yeah, but I want to ask you about this, how this has evolved from, because I had the same thought in looking back over these pieces and thinking about the Carnegies and the Rockefellers and the pressure to give wealth away or to serve a public good. But you're also a political reporter. And one of the things I find interesting, look, Americans have
live on just yacht reporting alone.
Americans have always venerated success, and we love the entrepreneur and the self-made person. And yet, in my own life in politics, in 2008, I remember we made a lot of hay in the Obama campaign about John McCain's wealth, which was trivial compared to this. As recently as 2012, it was a huge vulnerability for Mitt Romney that he had like an elevator in his house and that he had dressage horses and stuff. And only 12 years later, you have Elon Musk. And granted, we've had a little bit of a breakup recently, although I'm not sure I entirely believe it.
I agree.
I think it's a bit for show. But all of a sudden now it's like we have a billionaire president who's getting rich off of crypto schemes, leveraging the U.S. government, who's getting rich off of tariffs, leveraging the U.S. government. We've got a billionaire invited into the U.S. government with no seeming public concern about his conflicts of interest. Something broke here. The American veneration of success became like a complete capitulation to this. I mean, how do you tie your reporting here and your political reporting to explain kind of why we kind of succumbed to this level of kind of corruption of everything around us?
So I think this is like an essential question: is how do Americans ultimately feel about giant wealth? Are we resentful of it? Are we aspirational towards it? And there happens to be really good and interesting research that tells us the answer, and it happens to be quite eloquent on this question, which is, even last year, there was a poll that showed that 59% of Americans believe that billionaires are making the country less fair, and an identical share of Americans say they want to become billionaires themselves. And in fact, some people answer both in the affirmative. I think, and there's a reason, Americans have this really specific ambivalence about it. It's different in Europe, it's different in Asia, But that's part of the American idea. And I think, and this ties into the earlier question about what happened to the Zuckerbergs and the Bezoses of the world, which is that for a long time they were, in a sense, they were trying to appeal to that first half, that first 59%, that feel as if there is something we've crossed a threshold, that we've crossed a line that is out of the ordinary. And that's not an abstraction, that's a fact. I mean, today, the richest Americans have a larger share of overall wealth in this country than the Carnegies and the Rockefellers and the Vanderbilts did in the Gilded Age. We've never been in the territory we're in now as a share of the overall nation's wealth. But there was a point at which they decided, and I think that in some ways Donald Trump was both the cause and really more the symptom of something, which was that he activated this other side of the American character about wealth, the side that really on some level says, I do it because I can. I acquire the thing because I can. I exert my power and my ability to coerce because I can. And that became, I think, it was, if you looked at the faces on that stage on Inauguration Day, there was a sense of being unbound. I mean, here was a president who was unbound because he was now swaddled in immunity delivered by the Supreme Court. He, in theory, wouldn't be running for re-election and had more or less decided that nothing could stop him. And then you had people next to him who had decided that the American people have voted, they valorized this kind of the politics of the golden toilet. I'm not sure what else to call it. Essentially, the politics that luxuriates in the gap, in the economic inequality in this country. And I will tell you, I've talked to as part of my work, I go to a lot of events, a lot of rallies on all sides of the political spectrum. And I've talked to a lot of Trump voters over the years, and I get some version of the same thing all the time, which is, well, look, I think he actually imagines that I could end up like him. He, Trump, believes in me, this person who is perhaps languishing in their life. But and this is a question of political strategy and communications too. On some level, that voter is getting the message that this man, who we find in many cases to be utterly implausible as an agent of the working class, that he embodies the possibility of some transformation. I'll just give you one example. And, there was I won't beat this point because I think we could talk a lot on this, but I think there is a coal miner that I think of. In my last book, I spent a lot of time in West Virginia. I moved to West Virginia out of college. I worked at a little newspaper there, and I've worked over the years going back and forth a lot. And there's a guy named David Efa, a coal miner, who voted for Trump a couple of times. And he said, look, in the end, it's not that complicated. It's because he said he would bring back the coal mines, and nobody else said they would. And I think that that's a separate question from whether Trump did. He did not. In fact, coal mining employment went down over the course of his term. But that same man, David, also said to me, he is acutely aware and uncomfortable with the level of economic inequality in this country as represented by the fact that CEO pay, as we now know, the ratio of CEOs in public companies to frontline workers has now, as of last week, is now 350 to 1. It was 20 to 1 in the 1960s. That's the pace of change. And I remember David Efa sitting in his living room. He said, do you really know any man who's worth 300 or 400 other men? He said, I've never met one. Meaning the value, like the dignity of a man. And I think there is those combination of impulses. On the one hand, to vote for a kind of magical thinking, and on the other hand, to believe that there's something objectionable about this level of cavernous gap between these two.
Yeah, I mean, I actually, you made me change my question with that end. Because it's not even a question. The point I was going to make quickly is that one of the things Trump's done quite well is, look, I'm doing fine, but I recently had a toilet catastrophe too. That little valve broke and is leaking out. And yet,
my wife might be able to help you.
Yeah, if you went to a Trump rally, they would somehow think that you, Evan Osnos, New Yorker writer, and me, Ben Rhodes, podcasts, New York Times contributor, we're the elites, not Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos. And I was like, well, maybe I could take their yacht for if I'm the elite, but put that aside. What I wanted to ask you is, this does not feel sustainable to me, right? Yeah. It feels like the Titanic is being looted before it sinks, or it feels like people are extracting what they can because they feel like revolutionary conditions emerging. We're going to get to what's happening just a couple miles from here, but not yet. Because you write in here about these guys who are planning for the apocalypse, and we've all read about. And actually, I interviewed Jacinda Ardern for my podcast today, the former Prime Minister of New Zealand, and she, Peter Thiel, one of these guys, mega billionaire tech guy, has like some bunker in New Zealand that he's built, right? And you delve into that subculture. But the question I want to ask based on that, and also what you've been saying, is, should we be concerned that part of what is happening is there is a sense that this whole enterprise of American capitalism is overheating, and this inequality is exploding in an unsustainable way, and it's actually kind of creating the conditions for some kind of backlash? And that, what did you learn on reporting about the kind of people that want to have escape valves in places like New Zealand or Western Canada or wherever, about what does that tell us about what they really, even if they say, this is right and MAGA is great, what does that tell us about their self-awareness that once people figure this out, that it's not going to be sustainable?
Yeah, when I first started reporting on this, it kind of wasn't yet a part of the public kind of pop culture. It originally was this story, and it ignited people's sense of dread. That what does it mean that the most successful people who have also succeeded largely by reading the tea leaves of American society are essentially looking for an escape hatch? And the way, I think there's a couple things that have happened. One is that the kinds of people that succeed in places like Silicon Valley, and to some degree on Wall Street, are people who can imagine wild scenarios, either on the upside or the downside. That's kind of what the discipline requires. And as a result, you tend to have these extravagant imaginings, and you kind of have to be able to do that to prosper in that world. But then also you add one other element, which is, and as people said to me and I quote them on the record in this essay, they are very aware of the fact that the advent of AI and things of that kind are going to generate a public backlash, because it's going to be so destabilizing to the systems by which we define not just our income and our daily life, but our sense of meaning and our sense of worth in a society. And so they started to plan for that. And then at the same time, I had a fascinating interview with a technologist named Max Levchin, who is quite actively opposed to this idea of plotting for how you're going to escape in the event of a disaster. He says, it's the thing I hate most about living in Silicon Valley. He says this notion that we are kind of masters of the universe, I'm paraphrasing here, who move the needle, as he said, on history. He said, every time this comes up at a dinner party, which was a telling expression, he said, I shut it down, because I say, well, if you're so concerned about the end of the world, how much have you given to your local homeless shelter? How much are you actively trying to protect this enterprise? And I think in the end, the fact is that a lot of the things we've been talking about are a form of gilded withdrawal from this political commons. From this engagement, which is the underlying fact of what it means to exist in a society. And there's a reason why they don't want to talk about this one either, because it's not a good look. And in a way, I think it's a reflection of the fact that I use the term in here that we're approaching an untenable imbalance. And that's it's a pretty bleak expression, but history is pretty clear on this matter, that when you get to a point when things get so wildly out of the historical norm, when the gap in power and money becomes so profound, systems really do break down. They become brittle. They become less resilient. They become more polarized. Now, at the point where you're all going to lie on the floor and weep, I have some decent news, though, however, which is that we have really good examples of how to avoid the worst consequences. In fact, we have it in our own history. You've written about recently, what does it take to go from the Gilded Age to the Progressive era?
Yeah.
You know, how do you get from one to the next? And I will put that question, I'll pose that question to you, because I want to hear your sense of this as somebody who knows how politics actually works. But what I find fascinating is there was an incredibly similar moment. I mean, at the end of the 19th century, lifespans of the poorest Americans were declining for the first time in American history, and yet technology was coming online in all kinds of exciting ways. You had the telephone and the typewriter and the elevator, all these things for the first time. And it was this real sense that either it was going to be a utopia or a dystopia. There was a novel by Jack London that he published in 1908 called The Iron Heel, where he imagined, if you can believe it, a fascist oligarchy in the United States in which 0.9% controls 70% of the nation's wealth. And yet we went from that into not only the most prosperous century in human history, but also the Great Compression in which inequality narrowed. And I have a theory of the case for how or why, but I'm curious how you think that happens, because you've watched this process.
So this is really interesting to me, and I'm glad this is the hope, and because I'm going to ask one more bleak question, but this is the hopeful part, and then people should think of questions. We have time for some audience questions. But if you look back at the Gilded Age, right, the late 19th century, the first step was this extreme wealth was building for like a long time, for a couple decades. And this inequality was widening in the kind of same, Venn diagram as it is now, although it's worse now. But people started to connect the dots. And what was really important, and this is, I think, the task of the political opposition in this country, not just Democrats, because actually in the late 19th century, it started with populists who were neither Democratic or Republican. They were going to the farmers, and they were saying, not just, hey, look how rich those guys are. They were saying, hey, do you understand that they're making deals with the railroads to cheapen the way in which your crops can be taken to market in ways that kind of cut you out of the profits? Do you understand that they're using tariffs, and tariffs were a big issue, in ways that are making it more difficult for you to sell your product? You are getting this free land from the Homestead Act, but then there are all these financial instruments. You have to lease the equipment to develop that land. And I know this can sound kind of strange if you're not a 19th century farmer, but essentially the core point to recognize is that they were telling people not to be angry about the fact that those people were rich, but to be clear about why those people were getting rich in ways that impacted your daily life, right?
Absolutely.
And so then what was really interesting is step one is to activate, and there are other examples of this, like financial panics, which took a lot of people under. They had to explain the reason these financial panics are happening, and this will sound familiar, is because these investors in Wall Street are creating these bubbles, and they're speculating, and they're trying to get rich, before it all crashes. And the interesting thing about it is the agenda that emerged, the progressive agenda that remade both political parties, the Republicans and the Democrats, it had all these components. It had, yes, some policies, like the beginnings of savings bank insurance, the beginnings of a safety net. It had workplace protections, end of child labor, but it also had the direct election of senators, political reforms in terms of how the system worked. The suffrage movement finally got a constitutional amendment. Let's bring more people in. Women were like, well, we need to vote here because this isn't working for us. It had the Federal Reserve, a government reform to stop financial panics from happening. And so it kind of comprehensively remade the American system in this progressive direction in a response to the Gilded Age. And to me, that's it. It's like you got to mobilize people by making them realize why they actually have a stake in this, beyond just being pissed that somebody's rich. And then you have to have a suite of reforms that are not just about, hey, here's a healthcare plan. It's like, we're going to change how this whole system works, you know.
And I think there's a couple of lessons in that story that are actually quite directly applicable to now. The roots of reform, as you're describing it, it can seem, okay, well, is that specific to those conditions? A couple of useful things to remember. The term the Gilded Age, of course, was given to us by Mark Twain in 1873. And he was describing a period very similar to the one we have now. You know, when he was growing up, there were like 20 millionaires in the United States. By the end of the century, there were thousands. But it was all concentrated. The money was being concentrated in a very small group. But here's the key point. It took a long time. It took sustained attention. It took investigative reporting, and it took cross-cutting. Muckrakers, You know, Ida Tarbell, who, by the way, maybe she would have enjoyed being on a yacht. It wasn't an option for her. But here's the point. It took naming and describing things and making them concrete and showing that actually that there were real ways of understanding this abstract sense of disillusionment. And the thing is, it took 19 years between the time that Twain named the Gilded Age and the passage of the first Antitrust Act, Sherman Antitrust Act in 1890. What that means is it took 17 years of sustained attention. That's something to remember. That means, and then even then, it was not finished. At that point, they had an income tax which the Supreme Court struck down. The Supreme Court said this is a communistic, agreed with the argument it was a communistic plot. And it took until 1913 for there to actually be a durable income tax in this country. The takeaway meaning that it takes years of sustained attention, and in that period, you're going to have, as you were describing a moment ago, you're going to have all of these different political elements in there. And so that the strategy has to be, in some sense, encompassing. It can't be narrow and categorical.
Yeah. I mean, the hopeful thing is you go from the Gilded Age to the Progressive Era to the New Deal to the Great Society. And then we get Reagan, and here we are. All right, one last question.
But along the way, they built this beautiful building, too. I mean, things happen.
One more question before we go to the audience, because I wanted to bring in what's happening here. And this is going to sound dark, but I to your point, I actually think it's empowering to try to understand what is happening, even if it's difficult. There's one way of looking at this, which is, you know, Donald Trump has an extreme or aggressive anti-immigration agenda. He's doing his deportations. He wants the military to be part of it, blah, blah. Then there's the kind of like he wants to be a dictator, which, again, we should also take seriously. I want to offer a third theory that I'm curious about your reaction. Building on the point that there's an awareness that there's something unsustainable with what's happening, and it's actually about to be turbocharged by the Trump, you know, if they pass this tax cut, they're deregulating everything. What they're really going after is peaceful protest. Yeah. And what they're really beginning to do, to my concern, is normalizing the deployment of the U.S. military in places like Los Angeles in response to what would normally be accepted localized protests. And is that not unlike? I mean, isn't that similar to building a compound in New Zealand, in the sense that, hey, we kind of know this isn't sustainable. We better get the troops into the streets so we have that. And if you think that I'm being fanciful here, this is what happened in Russia. Yeah. This is what has happened in Turkey. This is what's happened in several Latin American countries. I mean, when you create an oligarch system, you kind of need the military to be applied domestically, because otherwise people are not going to let the system sustain itself. Should we be concerned that there's some connection? And I gave you one theory, you can have a different one. Is there a connection between what is happening here and what is in this book?
Yeah, and don't take it from us. There is actually new and very powerful scholarship that shows that huge inequality leads to democratic erosion. We see this in one country after another. And the reason is in several respects. But the core fact of it is that as a society gets more apart, as these gaps become wider, as people become more aware of that there is a world that is inaccessible to them, they begin to look for people to blame, and they begin to look for leaders who give them the architecture of explanation. Somebody who says, I can cut the Gordian knot. And this is what you see in one country after another, where there is this pattern where a group of people who are, and we have different language in different places, but frustrated, cut off, left behind, nostalgic about the past, trying to recreate a world in which they felt like they were on the cutting edge of progress, that they begin to put more and more of their hopes in somebody who says, the only way I'm going to be able to protect you, my loyal supporter, is by getting rid of these niceties of jurisprudence and of civil liberties. We don't have the luxuries of enjoying that anymore because our enemies within have made it impossible. And that's why I'm going to use these instruments at our disposal. That's the path. And then I'll add one other piece of it, which is the sort of American sauce on the top of this, which is that other countries have pathways for money to influence politics, obviously. But in our country, it is so profound that we now have the point. I have to say, I tend to agree with you. I think that Musk and Trump are more likely to come up with a strategic détente eventually than they are to stay apart. But in the moment, Musk, in his own way, has given us this incredibly clear announcement of the problem. He literally tweeted out an entire career's worth of investigative reporting on campaign finance when he said, in effect, wait a second, where's the gratitude? I bought you the presidency. And without me, Republicans wouldn't have the Senate, wouldn't have the House. I mean, it was the most incredible. It was like the Rosetta Stone of American democratic collapse. And
he's
just
not even aware
tweeted
of the
right
Citizens
out.
United decision that made that possible.
Totally.
Right? Yeah.
No, it was like he was talking about a product that he bought and it wasn't working and it was defective and he was sending it back to Amazon and he wanted a new one.
All right, well, we have mics
We have
here
a
if
mic,
anybody
and-
has a question.
And I'm walking around. Who has a question? Oh my good. Okay. First you.
A lot of times we can understand our society better by contrasting it with the history and the morals of another society. And you mentioned this very briefly, but you didn't go into it. How does the typical European look upon great wealth and the role of the wealthy in society compared to our country? And why?
It's a great question. I mean, in a way, the specific American break with Europe was the idea of what Jefferson called us being an aristocracy of talent, that there would be no fundamentally dynastic transmission of power and wealth. Let's stipulate the obvious. From the very beginning, that was an imperfect promise. The vote was available to everybody as long as they were white, male, and had property. But it was the signature difference. In Europe, there was an expectation that there had always been, really since the Crusades, these long-running landed aristocracies, and it would always sort of ever be thus. And in a way, it's a subtler form of wealth. It tends not to be quite as American as ours is, this kind of very brazen expression of wealth. I mean, just to be quite specific about it, at one point, the European yacht brokers find it very disorienting to come to the United States and try to sell these very expensive yachts. Because in Europe, they know what the little signifiers are of somebody who would be able to buy one. They're wearing the right kind of jacket or the right kind of shoes. But in the United States, they complain. They come to Palm Beach and somebody could walk down the marina in ripped jeans and a t-shirt and have like a loud dog, and all of a sudden they treat this guy with disrespect, but it turns out that he's the richest person in town. And they find it completely mystifying how Americans kind of register the existence of great wealth.
And they have higher taxes.
If you could stand.
Yeah.
Please stand. Yeah.
Hi there. I have two questions, one for Mr. Rhodes and one for Mr. Osnos. So for Mr. Osnos, I'm still wringing my hair trying to figure out why the generation of old billionaires, like the Rockefellers and the Carnegies, dedicated so much to philanthropy and giving back to society, at least performatively, and why this generation is so different or has pivoted away from that model. Like, what are the themes or hypotheses you have for maybe why that's happened? Is it the type of founders, is it the type of rich people we have today, like they're founder CEOs in tech? Is it themes in macro society, like social media? Like, what are the strands there that potentially explain this? And then for Mr. Rhodes, speaking of, you were talking about educating and mobilizing people to understand how rich people today actually affect them directly. How do we mobilize and educate in an age of misinformation and declining quality of education?
Would you go first?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And, you know, I've thought a lot about this. And actually my views have changed. I think, you know, and the ways in which my views have, first of all, I think that the degradation of the education system in this country is not unintentional, right? Easier to, you know, control the populace if they are less educated. And there's been a kind of delegitimization of it too, right? Universities are bad, you know, schools are teaching the wrong things. But where my views have also evolved are with the tech platforms, where for years I was in all these, you know, working groups and meetings about how do you regulate social media, and I've kind of come to the realization that that's unlikely to happen anytime soon, right? So, but what is the answer? I actually think that if you look at, and again, I just finished up a book myself that has a section on the populist and progressive era. So that's why it's fresh on the brain. A lot of the education that happened then was there was an explosion of community-oriented associations in which people came together and they connected the dots. Like it wasn't like done through schools or through government programs or even really through newspapers, which were wildly partisan at the time. And actually, you know, speakers were a part of this. And actually, in an interesting way, quick aside, sometimes the people that are the first ones to ring the alarm, people are like, that guy's crazy, right? Like William Jennings Bryan, who's a pretty eccentric guy with all kinds of problems. But, you know, he was the populist who became the Democratic presidential candidate, lost multiple times. And yet his platform infused the platforms of the two parties. To connect back to what you're saying, I think this has to start in communities. It has to start at local levels. Like, we keep waiting for someone to educate us, you know, or waiting for some Democrats in Washington to come up with the right talking points, or waiting for the social media platforms to change. And I actually think that there's got to be a more bottom-up approach to beginning to push back. And that whenever America has political movements that emerge out of that, people begin to emerge out of nowhere, you know. And so I think we have to kind of stop looking for top-down solutions and kind of, and this takes time, I acknowledge, as Evan said, but look for that kind of bottom-up mobilization. AI is going to be really interesting in this case because I have a lot of concerns about AI. I'm not an AI optimist. But actually, you know, it could also be useful to this. That's a whole other topic. But that's, I think we have to kind of, it's in our DNA for there to be bottom-up political and communal organization in this country that forces change into institutions like political parties and other institutions. And I'm actually going to use this to pivot to Evan because I want to take one stab at this because I think about this a lot. Because you go to Pittsburgh and everything's Carnegie. You go, you know, you go to these cities that, you know, where these people felt compelled to build these institutions. I think that one of the reasons why is they were in those places. Yeah. They owned steel plants or they owned railroads that were physically in places that they then felt like, well, I better give back here, you know. And the wealth that is being created now is on computer screens or it's in tech products that are really nowhere in particular. Mm-hmm. And so there's no rootedness for these people. And there's no accountability. You know, even the bad things about the Carnegies and Rockefellers, you know, the bad working conditions, well, they dealt with strikes. They dealt with pissed off workers. And so then they they use their philanthropy to try to redress some of those grievances. And you can hide in Silicon Valley or behind a computer screen at a hedge fund without the kind of accountability. But that's why I think you do need this kind of localized mobilization.
I think there's also a link between what you were describing before about grassroots mobilization. Is what we're talking about here are the creation and the change of culture. And the reason why this ties into both the question of how wealth is regarded in Europe and also how the change in the culture around big philanthropy has moved, is that culture can change it can surprise us actually how fast it changes sometimes. Take same-sex marriage as a prime example. It was years of advocacy, but then it sort of hits that tipping point and things can change. And we sometimes assume that they can't. And it can change for the worse too. And in a way, there was this generation, as we've talked about a little bit about, of iconic philanthropists like Buffett and Gates. They were signing people up to the Giving Pledge. You'll remember this. This was kind of the dominant fact for a while. And then a new cohort came in, and they began to say different kinds of things. Like Elon Musk says that his greatest gift that he can give to humanity is being the CEO of Tesla because of what it's doing on climate. Or there's versions of that. Mark Andreessen, who is a very influential figure, has, in a sense, argued that conventional philanthropy, as he would put it, is less effective than making his investments, so he wants to use his money for investments. And I think that this is partly, honestly, part of this whole project is about identifying that there are different cultures that are valorized at different times, and they rise and they fall. And it's partly a decision about what are the signals that society is giving back. If society is giving back signals that say, hey, Elon Musk, we think what you're doing is great, you're a hero, every high school student wants to grow up and be you, then there's going to be a lot of little Musks coming up in, and I don't mean that as a reference to his family. But, I mean, just to really put a pin in this one, in a vivid way, Elon Musk, according to the New York Times, has a foundation that at times has given out so little that it is at risk of violating the law of how much you're required to give out every year. And again, according to the Times, one of his philanthropic investments, one of his philanthropic recipients is a school that's registered in his own home in which 5 of the 14 students in its first year were his own children. So that's a very different, we've gone from Carnegie and Rockefeller to that. And I mention this not to be bleak, but to say that it's also a question about who we begin to recognize, who we celebrate. And this is partly on my industry too, to say, who do we celebrate? Who gets on the cover of the magazines? I've often thought every year there's a person of the year on a magazine, and it's a kind of strangely amoral designation. It'll be somebody who invaded another country if they're the biggest name of the year. But what if actually that instead of valorizing that, what we're valorizing is somebody who has made generational investments in health and education and in advancing the things that we actually care about? What if we're measuring our achievements and our status not by the length of the boats, but ultimately by the way that people are making a more substantive contribution? That's available to us.
I think that's a perfect place to end. I thank all of you for coming. Thank you, Evan. Thank you, Ben. Ben will be signing the book in the lobby, and it's terrific. Thanks a million.
My pleasure.